Hello, and you're watching Scotland at 7. I'm Hugh Stewart. Tonight we're going to be talking about the main points of the news with a focus on the UK Chancellor's budget, which was delivered today. And I'm going to be discussing the items with Professor John Robertson, who's joining us from down in Ayrshire. But before that, as usual, I'll begin with today's coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 3,388,658 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs or the UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,756,258 have been confirmed negative, while 632,400 have tested positive. There are 2,566 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test today, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all of those with symptoms will be tested. There are unfortunately 27 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,099. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 925 were in hospital last night, 57 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,311,339 people have received their first dose of the COVID vaccination, and 3,899,153 have received a second dose. The latest UK daily figures show 140,041 patients who had tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 207 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. Now tonight, it being a Wednesday, we have an update from the NRS, National Records of Scotland. And they tell us that as of the 24th of October, 11,538 deaths have been registered in Scotland, where the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, was mentioned on the death certificate, according to statistics published today by the NRS. In the week 18th to 24th of October, 130 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, which is 11 fewer deaths than last week. 20 deaths were of people aged under 65, 32 were from age 65 to 74, and there were 78 deaths in people aged 75 or over. 76 deaths were male and 54 were female. 8 COVID-related deaths occurred at home or in non-institutional settings, 108 deaths were in hospitals, and there were 14 in care homes. John, we're going to go on to discuss, we'll probably spend about 20 or 30 minutes or so discussing some aspects of the UK budget. I don't know if you had a chance to digest any of those numbers there, but it looks like we seem to be levelling off now at about 2,500 infections a day in Scotland, with usually something like 20 deaths. Is this good news or is this indifferent or bad news?
I think, I don't think it's particularly good, and it's not particularly bad, I suppose, relative to the situation in the other 4 nations, where the infection levels are far higher, and in England and Wales still climbing quite steeply. I think the word I've heard used, and the word I agree with most, is stubborn. I think the infection levels in Scotland are stubborn. They're mostly amongst the young as well. Infection levels, admissions to hospitals, clearly actually still falling. Not very fast, but falling. Numbers in ICU really quite low now. So, it's still too high to be comfortable with. Clearly too high to be comfortable with, and it causes worry. But there are positives in that. It's not out of control. It's nowhere near out of control. And despite some of the media coverage suggesting there is a crisis in NHS Scotland, I think that's a massive exaggeration. We saw today Glasgow, I gather, in the last 24 hours, the lowest number of new cases in mainland Scotland. That's quite an achievement for Glasgow.
Yes, it's only a few weeks ago all the papers were talking about very high figures, but one thing we have to be aware of with this infection is that, well, you really can't predict. It's so changeable, and who knows what it's going to be like into November and December. Yes, but let's take the good news. At least things are not getting worse at the moment. Okay, the main item today, and we're going to spend quite a lot of time looking at the different aspects of it, is, of course, the Chancellor's budget. So I'll go through that, John, with some major bullet points at a time. So today, as I'm sure everyone knows, the UK Finance Minister, that is Chancellor Rishi Sunak, outlined the UK's tax and spend plans for the period ahead. As some areas of spending, of course, are devolved, most of his budget speech refers to policies for England and Wales. But we're going to look at, first of all, the overall effect of the UK budget and prospects for the economy as it affects Scotland. So first of all, the main announcements, UK level, the UK economy is expected to grow this year by 6.5%. The Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, then expect the economy to grow by 6% over 2022, and then by 2.1, then 1.3, then 1.6% over the following 3 years. In July last year, at the height of the pandemic, unemployment was expected to peak at 12%. However, today, the OBR expected that unemployment will peak at 5.2%. So that means only over 2 million people out of work fewer than was previously feared. The Chancellor also pointed out that wages are rising. Compared to February 2020, they have grown in real terms by almost 3.5%. The Chancellor then drew attention to the return of inflation, which has been historically low for the last few years. Currently, UK inflation runs at 3.1% on the Consumer Price Index, and the Chancellor expects this figure to grow to 4%. The OBR, however, warns that inflation may in fact peak at 5%. Chancellor Sunak gave a twofold explanation for this increase. On the one hand, increased demand as the economy bounces from the COVID slowdown, and on the other, rising international costs, particularly of energy. He expects that it will take some months to ease these pressures, which he points out are also felt by the other economies around the world. Well, John, let's have a quick look at inflation first of all. Now, that's when I first studied economics at Paisley, inflation's all people wanted to talk about. The wages prices spiral, trade unions trying to get in ahead of next year's inflation and all that. So once again, it looks like we're back to the 70s only without the prog rock music.
Yeah, very good. Well, you're the economist here rather than me. It's an area I've little expertise in. It looks like a kind of predictable bounce back, doesn't it, from the effects of the pandemic lockdowns, that the economy would burst back into life as people return to work and to greater economic activity. I'm what's the word? I'm not really much impressed by any of it. BBC Scotland have been hugely impressed. They're obsessed with the windfalls and the spending spree and the eye-catching offers that the Chancellor is making, increased spending everywhere. And Scotland, of course, is going to get a massive benefit from that in terms of a union benefit, you might say. So I'm not sure it's surprising. I mean, human beings, I think I may have mentioned last week, are a very resilient species. Much to the worry of all the other species on the planet, we seem to survive the worst of things and come back. I know we lose some of our number, but remarkably resilient, I think.
Oh, well, let's hope so, yeah. Well, that's the first point anyway, is about inflation. It is really, it is under control. There are things we can do about inflation, so maybe we shouldn't panic about it too much. So let's look at government borrowing now. Again, this is one of the issues that's, seems to have been the main focus of government policy really since the days of Osborne and Cameron, keeping borrowing down. So what did the Chancellor have to say about that? In his speech today, the Chancellor published a new charter for budget responsibility. So these are 2 new fiscal rules which have been outlined today for the first time. The first of these rules is that underlying public sector net debt, that's what we used to call the national debt, excluding impact of Bank of England policies, must be falling as a percentage of GDP. So he's saying for the first of these new rules, whatever the national debt was last year, next year it's got to be a bit smaller, right? The second of the new rules is that in normal times, the state should only borrow to invest in future growth and prosperity. In other words, only borrow for capital investment, and up to 3% of GDP for such capital spending is anticipated. On the other hand, everyday spending has to be paid for through taxation. So those are the 2 fiscal rules the Chancellor has outlined today. And meanwhile, welfare spending must be on what he called a sustainable path. He didn't really explain what that is exactly. Now let's look at debt. So the underlying national debt, or the national debt, is forecast to be about 85.7% of GDP. So if taking the GDP measure of the size of the economy, that's the gross domestic product, over the year 23 to 24, the national debt is expected to be about 85.7% of the economy. Under today's projections, it then falls in the 3 years after that till it goes down to 83.3%. So again, as predicted, then as required, the numbers show a gradual increase from 85 down to 83. So that's rule number one kept. At least that's if things work out as planned. Okay, so that's total debt. Now, what about the deficit each year? That is every year's the difference between tax and spend. The deficit this year is expected to be 7.9%, but then that falls to 3.3%, then 2.4%, 1.7%, and 1.5% over the following years. So that's this year's debt is obviously high because of the COVID contraction, but as the economy expands, the percentage debt goes down. Also, of course, the tax income increases once people get back to work. Now, I'll move on to the living wage now, and perhaps John might have something to say about that. The Chancellor reminded the House that it was a Conservative government which introduced the national living wage in 2016, although the national minimum wage came from a previous Labour government. The Independent Low Pay Commission, which brings together economists, business groups and trade unions, recommended that the living wage should be increased by 6.6% up to £9.50 an hour. And so for a full-time worker, that's a pay rise of over £1,000. And this will benefit the 2 million of the lowest paid workers in the country. Now, before I move over to you again, John, for a comment, I'll just go over what the Chancellor said about universal credit. Now, of course, the UK government over the last few weeks has been under pressure to maintain the temporary £20 a week uplift to universal credit, having already announced a few weeks ago that the uplift would end. And there was indeed no change of policy, no U-turn there. Although the point at which the universal credit stops with income has been tapered. So the talk today was all about the universal credit taper. And what that means is the effective marginal rate of tax has been reduced. Now, what that means is, as soon as you get to the trigger where your benefit is cut, previously your tax then shoots up effectively by 63%. That's because your benefit is cut. And so that taper has been reduced from 63% to 55%. In other words, if a person moves over the threshold, they only lose 45p of the next pound they earn instead of losing 37% of it. Okay, so the marginal rate of tax for people on universal credit falls from 63% to 55%. Okay, well, John, cause for celebration there among the low paid.
Well, I mean, no sign there of the BBC's eye-catching windfalls or spending sprees for the less well-off in this country. Before and after these changes are implemented, the UK is and will remain one of the most unequal societies in the most unequal society in Northern Europe, and the most brutal in terms of its treatment of its unemployed and its unwell and all of the other minority groups. This is just pathetic window dressing. It will make no difference at all, and people will still be in food banks, and people will still be suffering chronic illness because of poor quality housing and so on. I had complete and utter contempt for all of that.
Well, thank you, John. That's a forthright statement. In fact, what you've said actually has been echoed by other commentators we've seen today. Ross Greer of the Green Party in Scotland has made very similar remarks. So, yes, as we can see there, so there's no great change to the marginal rate. The marginal rate is what's important in tax. It's a disincentive effect. People often comment on how the disincentive effect seems to work differently with poor people compared with rich people. It's the highest marginal taxes are actually at the lower end of the income distribution,
and we saw
not at the top.
Yeah, and we saw 30 30 billionaires wrote to the Chancellor and said, tax us more. The money is just stockpiled, doing nothing offshore. It's not even improving the quality of their lives. They can't do anything with it. Put that money back into the economy, give some of it to the less well paid, and what will they do with it? They'll spend it all, and the economy will benefit.
Yep.
Get
Yes, that's
angry.
how. Incidentally, a well-known theory in economics that you've just summarised there, John. That's about. Well, that could have been Professor Keynes himself talking there. Now let's move on to the union. Now, sometimes people, I haven't heard anyone say this today, but sometimes people talk about the Chancellor's budget year after year and say, well, was today a political budget? Did the Chancellor, first of all, have in mind where the ruling party is going over the next couple of years before the election? Now, one political aspect that definitely, explicitly spelled out by the Chancellor was the idea that this was a budget for the whole of the United Kingdom. He did take a paragraph to stress the benefit for Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales of being in this union. And of course, he was pointing out that, two things. First of all, the Barnett formula today, the Barnett formula means that whatever spending increases go to England are also passed on proportionately. So, for example, there's an extra 4.6 billion for Scotland, another 2.5 billion for the Welsh Government, and another 1.6 billion for the Northern Ireland Executive. And quoting from the Chancellor, this delivers, in real terms, the largest block grant to the devolved administrations since the devolution settlements of 1968. So in gross terms, lots of money. However, Kate Forbes, the Scottish Finance Secretary, was not impressed. Talking about the block grant, she today argued that, in reality, the Scottish Government will receive less grant funding in every year of the spending review than it has in the year 21-22, despite the challenges presented by COVID. However, drawing attention to what he called the indisputable benefits of being part of the United Kingdom, the Chancellor outlined several UK-funded projects in Scotland which bypass the Scottish Government. There's a list of these, but for example, the UK Government is directly funding the Extreme E race in Scotland, which is the 2022 Hebrides Grand Prix, which I think is hydrogen-powered or battery-powered or something like that. And that could only happen with the London funding, apparently. Plus, there are schemes announced separately by the UK's Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack, such as a community pub in Knoydart, such as funding for the Glasgow Burrell Collection and funding for the Dumbarton Town Centre. There are some other projects as well of that sort, very small-scale local projects, which are being funded not by the Scottish Government, but directly from London. So Mr. Jack, Scottish Secretary, talked of the era of real devolution, taking power away from Brussels and dealing directly with the local authorities who know their communities best. So that was the second strand of the union benefit, that Alistair Jack is targeting money directly to Dumbarton Town Centre. Right. For the Scottish Government, again, Finance Secretary Kate Forbes said, the Chancellor has pushed ahead with this centralised approach to levelling up, ignoring the views of governments in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. It means money Scotland would previously have received under European Union's Social Fund to spend according to its own needs will now be distributed according to a UK government agenda. So, John, that's about real levelling up, according to Alistair Jack. This is real devolution, and that's what devolution means. It means Alistair Jack decides where the money's going.
Yes, well, you were finding it difficult to keep a straight face yourself presenting that, and Kate Forbes has been very clear about it. She always is very clear. This is just shuffling the pack, and with it, and you mentioned earlier, what a budget's for, and clearly a budget is often, I think they have been for a long time, is about ideology, about politics, about presentation, as much as it is about substantive change, because a lot of the actual apparent substantive change is just taking money from one place, putting it somewhere else, and also much of it is actually borrowing from ourselves, in a sense, borrowing from the Bank of England, and then pretending that's somehow a massive debt that we built up, when it's our bank in the first place. I mean, it's just the whole thing is laughable, and I hadn't heard of the race in the Hebrides. Was it the E something? I thought that was food additives, big E's.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
apparently, no, I'm afraid I hadn't heard about it until the Chancellor brought it to my attention today. So I will look it up as soon as I get home. The Hebrides Grand Prix. So I think it's something to do with environmental fast cars. Right. Anyway, so
Yeah. You'll
couldn't
have
be
to watch. I think they'd be better to go for rally cars rather than Grand Prix in the Hebrides. I've
that.
been on some of those roads. I'm not sure they're cut out for Grand Prix.
That would be challenging, yeah, indeed. So that's what they're doing anyway. They're saying, yeah, they're trying to, well, there's a clash here, isn't there, about what to do with the European money, right? So losing all those European funds, Michael Gove has always said, we will replace them. Every pound that you haven't got from Europe, we will replace it. So that's what the Chancellor is anxious to do, and Alistair Jack again is saying that. Because we're now, this is a phrase that was used, or something like this was used several times by the Chancellor today. He said that because we're no longer in the European Union, we can do this, we can do that. Oh, and incidentally, Rachel Reeves, speaking for the opposition Labour, also made the same point. She wanted to change VAT because we're no longer in the European Union. So there's a bit of there's an ideological debate here going on about are we better off without the European Union? Does that give us a better opportunity to make our own choices? So for Alistair Jack, it's yes, as long as those choices are made at UK level and not at Scottish level. Okay, I'll just move on. I suspect you probably agree with me on that, John. So I'll just move on to the next topic, right?
Yes.
Another issue involving Scotland, which Chancellor Sunak announced today, was changes to the airport passenger duty. The Chancellor announced cuts to this tax for domestic flights, saying it's a boost to regional airports like Aberdeen, Belfast, Inverness and Southampton. However, speaking for the SNP today in Parliament, Ian Blackford pointed out that air passenger duty, which is in fact devolved to the Scottish Government, does not apply to Inverness Airport anyway, because the Highland airports in fact were kept exempt from it. Also, on the same point, Ross Greer for the Scottish Green Party said, this incentive to travel by air took a wrecking ball to the UK's climate obligation when we are only a few days away from the COP. He added, to cut aviation taxes just days before hosting COP26 has confirmed the UK government's reputation as an international embarrassment. Right, airport duty. An odd story, this one, because the Scottish Government always wanted it devolved so they could cut it. And then once it was devolved, of course, they changed their mind.
Yeah, it's just one of many examples of the lack of any kind of coherence in what this cabinet does in Westminster. They're not united themselves. They're not united within the group. You know, they will sometimes come out with ideas that are completely contrary to what the others think, and the idea that just as COP26 approaches, we should do away with it with air passenger duty is, to many of us, is laughable. But of course, to them, it's not laughable because they don't connect them up. Just as they don't connect up the revelations of the huge amounts of human waste being discharged into English rivers. Of course, you might think from BBC coverage that it's all of the UK's rivers, and from the media coverage. I mean, that's something else. I mean, as we approach COP26, one of the Guardian journalists today imagined Boris going for a swim in the Clyde, and how he would be affected by the human waste there. She completely ignored the fact that there hasn't been a leak in the Clydes since 2016, when there was an accidental leak of human waste into the Clyde. And I think from 2016 to now, it might well have flushed away.
Yes, let's hope so. I haven't looked into it myself, actually, but I'm hoping that the Scottish authorities, the SEPA, are able to secure the kind of chemicals that for some reason are unavailable in England. I haven't looked into that, but undoubtedly, I think you're right about the confusion. One of the reasons, incidentally, that we have Broadcasting Scotland is because of this kind of confusion about what is UK-wide and what's in Scotland. And the BBC itself, well, the national broadcasters, often seem to forget. You know, are we talking about England and Wales, or are we talking about everybody? That's a confusion that you often get in London-based media. That's why we're here.
Yeah. I did this morning have a look, and I managed to find SEPA figures, which, I mean, obviously these discharges are at times of heavy rainfall, And it may be that it would require massive investment in the infrastructure to be able to cope with periods of heavy rainfall and not have discharges of this kind. But judging by the statistics I could dig up, from SEPA and the English statistics, the frequency into English rivers is around three times as common, and the quantity, the amount of time in which a discharge takes place, and therefore the quantity of discharge, is massively higher in the privatised English system.
Yes, it's well. Just finally on that, a chat I picked up yesterday on social media was about saying, remember a few years ago when water was privatised in England? Of course, water is not privatised in Scotland. Another thing we should remember. When water was privatised in England, the argument given was that the necessary investment could only come from the private sector. So people are saying, well, where is it? What's happened to all that private investment if they can't even deal with their own domestic waste? So moving on. So John, I'll just finish on the budget by looking at some more remarks that Ian Blackford made in reply. So in the House today, after the Chancellor sat down, we had Rachel Reeves from the Labour Party. She was sitting in because apparently Keir Starmer has actually had to isolate because of a COVID contact. So Rachel Reeves spoke for the Labour Party, and following that, Ian Blackford spoke for the SNP. Now, he said today that it's increasingly clear that there can be no fair recovery under Westminster control. The only way to keep Scotland safe from Tory cuts is to become an independent country. Speaking in reply to Chancellor Sunak, Mr Blackford said that the country is suffering from three crises at the same time: a cost of living crisis, a Brexit crisis, and the COVID crisis. On universal credit, Mr Blackford argued that the Chancellor was grabbing £20, then giving £10 back. He also argued that Scotland had been short-changed on carbon capture, with the further postponement of the carbon capture and storage scheme which is proposed for St Fergus near Aberdeen. As the UK government had decided not to go ahead with the Boris Bridge to Ireland, could the money saved not be diverted into supporting Scotland's just transition in the North East? Meanwhile, backing that up, the SNP's business spokesperson Stephen Flynn today said, with just days to go before the global COP26 summit gets underway in Glasgow, the Chancellor's budget fell shamefully short of the action desperately needed towards a just transition. Criticising the UK government's decision to focus on two carbon capture and storage schemes in the north of England instead of the Aberdeen scheme, Mr Flynn described the UK government's position as illogical, as it ignored the estimated 15,100 jobs which could be created by the Scottish cluster, to which the Scottish Government would commit $500 million in the Just Transition Fund. These jobs would be in carbon capture, use and storage, hydrogen and direct air capture technologies, and according to Mr Flynn are an opportunity to show global leadership and to grasp the opportunities the green economy can provide. And on the same point, Kate Forbes, again, Scottish Finance Secretary, said, no one would guess from this budget that COP26 is actually taking place next week. There is no sign of the ambition required to tackle the climate crisis. Ms Forbes said that the UK government has ignored a transformative carbon capture project in the North East that would have created 20,000 jobs and built on the region's energy expertise. So I think there's two jobs totals for different years, but I think at its peak, I've seen the plans for this project, so it's excellent, except that it isn't happening. And it does work on these new technologies, which are going to simultaneously produce hydrogen, which you can then use to run the Peterhead power station, and also put a lot of carbon dioxide back down in the ground. So massive project, great prospects, and it's not happening. The Scottish Green Party and Kate Forbes and the SNP are united in saying this is a missed opportunity.
Yes, and clearly an ideological decision rather than one based on any kind of understanding of the economic situation. And deeply ironic as well, given the popularity of the phrase with Boris Johnson, that this project is shovel ready.
Yes, absolutely. The thing about the North East project particularly is that Well, you've got the underwater expertise, you've got the pipelines, and you've got the geological storage. Yeah, so everything's rare, everything's there, just needs to go ahead. Um, I don't think we should get involved in a Scotland v England debate. I mean, I raised it myself that there are two projects which got the funding instead, which is in the northeast of England, and also one in the Liverpool in the Mersey area. From what I've been reading, there's so much carbon that has to be captured and stored that there's easily room for 2, 3, 10 projects of this size. So it's not a case of either we build it in Scotland or we build it in England. It's a case of if we're going to keep this carbon somewhere, we need to start doing it and on a big scale. So this really would have been the test case to get on with it, right? So they're not doing that. Okay, so we will return to that actually on Broadcasting Scotland. That's an issue we're going to return to on Friday. Okay, so that's quite a lot on the budget. So we're going to move on, John. Thank you for your comments on that. And so I wonder what you have been reading on our next topic. It's been announced today from the Scottish Government that there is going to be a complete rethink on how qualifications and assessment are conducted in Scottish schools and colleges. So exams and national qualifications are to be reformed, the Education Secretary has confirmed. Shirley-Ann Somerville said, new qualifications will be developed to ensure learners' achievements are fairly recognised. It's expected that externally marked exams will remain part of the new assessment approach. Learners studying for national qualifications in spring next year will not be affected by any changes. A wide range of views will be sought on the reforms, with young people and teachers informing how the new system will work. The decision to make changes was influenced by, firstly, recommendations of the OECD's independent review of Scotland's school curriculum, and secondly, renewed debate about the assessment following the cancellation due to COVID-19 of the National 5 higher and advanced hires back in 2020 and this year in the spring of 2021. And thirdly, a paper by the renowned academic Professor Gordon Stobart settling out options for Scotland's future qualifications, for Scotland's future approach to assessment and qualifications. The Education Secretary made the announcement as she updated Parliament on plans to implement the 12 recommendations in the OECD's reviews of curriculum for excellence. Though the OECD's recommendations are being taken forward and will involve input from stakeholders including children and young people. Ms Somerville said, it remains a key priority of this government to ensure that our approaches to curriculum and assessment are fit for purpose and so guarantee the best possible educational experience for children and young people, not least as we emerge from the pandemic. I am convinced that given the experience and views expressed over the last 2 years, the time is right to signal that the Scottish Government supports reform of national qualifications and assessments. So we've been looking back, of course, at 2 years when old-fashioned exams weren't possible, and so we really had assessment by lecturers and teachers. So we had continuous assessment, coursework, instead of exams. So it's always been said, John, that boys are good at that. Boys are good at cramming for the last minute and getting the exam out of the way. And girls are better at the methodical, organised approach you need to coursework. So how do you think this plays?
Well, I mentioned earlier, I've got a bit of a background in this. Before I got involved in media research, I was in schools and teacher education for more than a quarter of a century. And I've had a look at what's the early signs coming out about this allegedly radical reform have got me somewhat underwhelmed that somehow that externally marked exams must be retained. There is an opportunity now, and there are opportunities after pandemics. You know, the Black Death wasn't all bad. It was obviously very bad, but it actually improved the circumstances of the surviving peasantry and maybe led to a kind of slightly more equal society. And the recent pandemic has had some beneficial effects, I think, on flexibility in the workplace. We already see signs of people not having to commute every day to work, being able to work from home and take advantage of the new technologies that facilitate that. We've had for about a quarter of a century as well, maybe more than that. So I'd say chuck the exams out. And I think a radical approach would justify that. You mentioned there about boys being good at cramming for exams. There is, to my knowledge, there is no meaningful research showing any positive correlation between performance in exams and performance afterwards in the workplace. I think there's nothing there. The workplace is far more like continuous assessment, where you have to be able to do things every day, not just cram and do them on one day, and also where you don't have to know everything. These days, you need to know how to find things. Now, we've been saying that for about half a century, that's what people need to have, is the skill to find things rather than remember things. So here's another opportunity. Chuck the exams out.
Right. Thank you very much, John. That's really good to hear a clear view. I don't know whether the Scottish Government is going to come to that view. I have to say, in my own recent experience, because I retired as a college lecturer just last March, but what I had been doing, because of the subjects I was teaching, was entirely coursework, 100% coursework. And I can just throw my oar in and say, the students who passed my courses produced some really good work. They produced excellent understanding through their coursework. So I don't see any benefit from getting them all into a room and saying write down as much as you can until I say stop. So let's move on. Let's have a curriculum based on the skills that people need in the information age. Good. I think, sorry, John, there's not very much disagreement tonight, but let's hope we can find something we can disagree on later on. Now, first of all, before we do that, there's, I'm afraid, a very unpleasant news story which came to our attention today. A serving Metropolitan Police officer in London has been charged with rape. A serving Met police officer has been charged with rape, alleged to have taken place last weekend. The Met said that the officer charged is PC Adam Zaman, aged 28, and the incident was alleged to have taken place on Sunday evening. The force said Zaman was off duty when the alleged rape occurred and was arrested the following day following a complaint to police. The Met said that the officer has been remanded in custody and would appear at the Westminster Magistrates Court on Wednesday afternoon. Zaman has been suspended from duty and the police watchdog has been informed. The Met said that the alleged incident took place in the part of London covered by the City of London force. In a statement, the Met said, the Met's Directorate of Professional Standards has been informed and PC Zaman has been suspended. The matter has been referred to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. Zaman is based in the East Area Command Unit covering east of London. He was charged on Wednesday following an investigation by the City of London Police. DCS Paul Trevors, policing commander for the East Area Command Unit, said, I recognise that the public will be concerned to hear that a serving officer has been charged with such a serious offence. We absolutely share that concern. So clearly, John, this is an allegation. We have no comment to make, of course, until the evidence is brought to court. But obviously this highlights the issues about the male concentrated and the male culture nature of policing. So we can't say anything about this case till we hear what evidence comes to light. But do the police have a problem about misogynist behaviour and attitudes?
Well, I'm going to say quite confidently that they don't have a problem anymore than the rest of society has in terms of toxic, you might call it toxic masculinity, misogyny, and other areas of unfortunate mindsets and racism as well. So that's the first thing I'll say, and I know that from the statistics that police officers are far less likely, pro rata per head of population, to commit any kind of crime than the general public, and they're far, far less likely to commit crimes of a sexual nature. We've had some very high-profile cases here. They're very upsetting, and they do reveal weaknesses. Weaknesses, I think, in selection here, that there is a tendency for people of the wrong mindset, people who like to control other people, people who are misogynist and racist, to think it'd be a good idea to join the police. That does happen, although we can see if we make comparisons with the United States, the situation in Britain is far less serious than it is. They have a very strong predisposition to appoint the violent and the extreme violent personality there. So, I think let's keep it in proportion here. Much of this is media exaggeration again.
Right. Well, that's well. Thank you for making that comment. We are aware that in the broadcasting Scotland that there is this tendency to jump on the bandwagon. If the media is talking about a particular issue this week, then that gets flagged up. Maybe that's why this story has come to us. But I was thinking as you spoke, yeah, we can't really expect police or any other institution to be separate from the society that it's part of. But it's good to note, as you've said, that then police, in fact, well, maybe it should be obvious, that police are maybe more law-abiding than the society in general. Well, we hope so. They're the police, but it's good to have your thoughts on that anyway, and some information. I'm going to move on to another topic now. As I said, that's of course an issue that's come up. We don't know any more about it. Here's another issue, going back to Brexit again. A report out today from the Port of Dublin says that freight traffic between the island of Great Britain and the Dublin port has dropped by a fifth since Brexit, while business with the EU and Dublin has leapt by more than a third. Exporters and importers in Ireland have been avoiding the Holyhead-Dover-Calais route over the past 9 months, bypassing the UK on one of the dozens of new ferry services to the continent which have opened up since the 1st of January. There are now 44 direct ferry routes between Ireland, France and the Benelux countries, up from 7 before Brexit. The European Affairs Minister Thomas Byrne said this earlier the month, and the report by the Dublin port reveals the blow leaving the UK has dealt to Holyhead and Liverpool, which are the main UK gateways to Ireland. Dublin port says only half of its containers now come from the UK compared to 64% before Brexit. Overall, the port reported a 21% decline in trade with ports in the UK in the first 9 months of the year, while there was a 36% increase in business with the EU. As Ireland's Foreign Minister Simon Coveney told the BBC Wales, companies have simply voted with their feet. For them, certainty is what matters, so they can plan for the future. Importers and exporters are avoiding the UK because of Brexit red tape on arrival in Calais and in Dublin on return routes. Well, this comes into to me, John, under the category of, well, there's a surprise. In economics, which I used to teach, we talk about trade diversion and trade creation. If you're in a customs union, within the customs union, you have more trade within the members, and you have less trade with the people who are outside of a customs union. That's also comes into the category of the bleeding obvious. So, are you surprised or shocked to find that there's less trade between Great Britain and Dublin?
I'm surprised it's not worse already. I've been reading about this as well. I mean, the Irish are not just buying ferries; they're building large ferries. They've built an absolutely huge ferry, which I think takes about 600 lorries on it, and they're bypassing the UK for as you say, for the bleeding obvious reasons that it makes sense to do. Large ferries are very efficient in terms of energy consumption. Compare them with road or even rail transport. They're a tremendously effective way of doing things. This is just the beginning of a trend. And it's not over yet. Holyhead and Liverpool are in worse trouble than they might think right now. And there's a very clear lesson for us, and that's to get the Rosyth to Zeebrugge or whatever, to get that link going. Because Scotland is a country of export dimension, at least comparable to Ireland, perhaps greater, I would think, maybe, than Ireland. And the idea that there isn't a large ferry port link to Europe in Scotland, it couldn't be a clearer example of how little the union does for us.
Yes, it's always struck me as really odd that it seems to be cheaper to put goods onto a truck and drive them to Dover than to put them on a boat. I mean, boats float. Surely it's easier to move thousands of tons of stuff on water than it is to drive it along tarmac. Yes, there has been a lot of discussion recently, I believe, on reopening that freight route from Rosyth over to mainland Europe. Maybe we should do a story on that. I don't have any more up-to-date information on that. But well, that's something I'll come back to. But yes, obviously, if Scotland moves towards a closer relationship with the European Union, then that will happen. That will happen. There will have to be trade between Scotland and Europe.
Yeah. Rosyth to Zeebrugge is only about half the distance of Dublin to Zeebrugge as well.
Yep. So again, I don't know why that route wasn't economical when it was happening before. Obviously, it was cheaper to run trucks down, but obviously the trucking industry has its problems. So maybe that again creates a market opportunity for one of these super ferries. So I'm sure we'll come back to this trade question again. We're going to move on to a new topic now. News we picked up today on Broadcasting Scotland from Israel about new settlements, new Israeli citizen settlements on the West Bank. A settlement monitor has today said that an Israeli committee has approved about 3,000 new settler homes in the occupied West Bank, a day after the Biden administration issued its strongest condemnation yet of the proposed construction. Word of the approval came from Hagit Ofran of the anti-settlement group Peace Now. There was no immediate confirmation from the Defence Ministry. Israeli public broadcaster Kan also reported that about 3,000 units have been approved. The ministry's Higher Planning Council, which authorises West Bank construction, convened on Wednesday to authorise the housing units, with more than half of them getting final approval before building starts. The start of the meeting was confirmed by the Israeli defence body, Kogat. It confirmed the approval of the new construction is bound to raise friction with the United States and Europe, anger the Palestinians, and test Israel's fragile coalition government, made up of ultranationalists, centrists, and dovish parties that oppose settlements. On Tuesday, the US Department of State said it was deeply concerned about Israel's plans to advance new settlement homes, including many deep inside the West Bank. The Palestinians seek the West Bank along with the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, areas occupied in the 1967-60 war, for their future state. The Palestinians view the settlements, which house around 700,000 Israelis, as the main obstacle to peace, and most of the international community considers them illegal. So there's a lot in this story, really. There's, on the one hand, there's Israel clearly trying to consolidate its stamp on the West Bank, and obviously trying to thwart the future development of the Palestinian state. On the other hand, there's the US attitude, given strong support by President Trump, but now the Biden administration is clearly setting its face against it. And the other thing that strikes me is the coalition. How can you hold together a coalition with such massive differences from the ultra-right to the moderate left? So, but it's going ahead anyway, isn't it?
Yes, I think it is going ahead. I think one of the things that's most revealing in this particular debate and shocks some people when they see it, the New York Times did this a year or two ago. They showed a map of Israel-Palestine, and they marked on what's supposed to be Palestine, the West Bank essentially. They marked the settlements. There is virtually nothing left. What would be Palestine is gone. It's entirely fragmented and covered in Israeli settlements. There is virtually nothing left. The only way that Palestine could be created now would be by mass evictions of hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers, and that's just not going to happen. Right. It's not going to happen. I hate to say this, but it's kind of over for Palestine as a freestanding. The idea of a twin state settlement. I think the only what's going to happen here is that Israel is consuming Palestine and will in the foreseeable future consume it completely, and you'll have Palestinian or Arab communities living in Israel, analogous to the North American Indians living within the United States. It's a very sad conclusion, but if you look at the map, it's hard to see any otherwise.
Well, yes, of course, we've been, I think maybe Israel's been playing us all a game for, how many years has Israel said we support the two-state solution, but they've been saying that, meanwhile doing exactly the opposite. So, yeah, looking at the reality, yes, John, it's hardly surprising you come to that conclusion. As we said in the report, this started with Israel's victory in the 1967 Six Days War. So ultimately, it's maybe military power which talks. It certainly does. You can't deny that. We're going to move on to one final story tonight, which I hope this is a bit more hopeful. The Scottish Government's Agri-Environment Climate Scheme will reopen for funding. It's being extended into 2022 to support the ambition of doubling the amount of land under organic management, which was set out in the programme for government in Scotland, 21 to 22. Farmers, crofters and land managers will be able to apply for support for conversion to and maintenance of organic land, alongside a suite of other measures aimed at promoting low carbon farming and protecting the environment. Scottish ministers have also agreed to deliver future rounds of refund up to and including 2024 to provide ongoing certainty in line with a wider campaign to prioritise local and organic produce in public sector menus as part of Scotland's green recovery. Rural Affairs Secretary Mary Gudgeon said, "Our vision for the future of rural Scotland is a positive one. We want Scotland to be a global leader in sustainable and regenerative agriculture. As part of that, we are committed to supporting farmers, crofters, land managers to support and deliver nature restoration." The AECS provides important funding to the sector and to help to achieve this commitment. And I have visited many organic farms, including the organic Peelham farm recently, which have benefited from AECS and are playing their part in helping to restore and enhance nature. This will help to deliver increased biodiversity, improved soils, and contribute to mitigating climate change at the same time as providing high quality, locally produced food. So again, there's quite a lot of issues in that story, which we'll not really have time to do justice to it. But looking over the main points, I think, well, at the end there, we've got food miles, really, trying to get your food reasonably close to where you live instead of flying it around the globe. And also this business of maybe looking after the soil instead of putting thousands of tons of fertiliser inputs onto it, which is the kind of the big agriculture approach. John, do you think this is a way forward, or we do get most of our food probably from big agriculture, from huge prairies? That's where the Weetabix comes from. It doesn't come from a wee organic farm in Berwickshire, does it? Can we feed ourselves, do you think,
No.
for wee organic farms?
Well, yeah. I mean, clearly you can't turn the system around instantly, but this looks like another example of an initiative, a commendable initiative by the Scottish Government to try and do something. To fight climate change and to green the economy in Scotland. And there have been several other small initiatives, and there have been some big successes. They're not getting much media attention. I mean, the obvious ones are, the 97% production of electricity by renewables, the massive exporting of electricity to England, the huge, more than massive perhaps, planting of trees in Scotland. More than 80% of the new trees in the UK last year planted in Scotland. It goes on, and several experts, United Nations experts and academics from England, and even UK government advisors have commended Scotland and, by definition, the Scottish Government's initiatives in this area, and actually trying to do something about that. But we do it with one hand tied behind our backs, of course. We can't borrow to invest properly in it, and we can't reuse the money that's being wasted on other things like Trident. But it's to be commended, and with independence, maybe we'll do a whole lot more of this.
Yes, I did actually read once that in a typical European country, something like 30% of the land could be under forest. England and Wales, it's usually about 8% or something like that. But Scotland had something like 15% tree cover, so not as much as Europe, but twice as much as in England and Wales. So it is actually part of the carbon policy as well. For example, I think peat and crofts were mentioned in the report. Peat lands contain a huge amount of carbon. So one of the things we can do to meet our climate goals is just to look after the soil. Good soil actually contains carbon, so we have to keep it, not let it blow away.
Of course, and the fact that it's only 15% in Scotland, I mean, you mentioned 15% is better than in England and Wales. The fact it's only 15%, of course, is largely to do with land ownership and the land being used for grouse.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, that's an issue which I think isn't going to go away in Scotland until there's been some severe land reform. Maybe that's an issue we should also tackle. There's such a lot we need to talk about. But So John Robson, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I think we're just about finished. So let me just introduce what we're doing the rest of the week. So tomorrow on Scotland in 7, your presenter will be Maggie Lennon again, usually on Thursdays. I'm going to be presenting another programme on Friday, a special, and we'll look at some of the issues we've raised tonight. So we're just about finished now. So first of all, before I sign off, can we thank John Robertson for joining us tonight? I find it particularly useful, John, to get your perspective and to get your research-based perspective. You know, it really is good to look at the headlines and then say, yeah, what actually is going on behind them? And let's try and find out what's really going on instead of just going along with the common view. So thank you, John. Thanks very much. I hope we'll see you again on Broadcasting Scotland. So that's just about it. That's how it looks tonight on Broadcasting Scotland. So thanks for watching. So I hope you can join us tomorrow with Maggie Lennon. So finally, an appeal. At Broadcasting Scotland, we are planning an exciting range of programmes over the next 2 weeks, of course, as the UN Climate Change Conference flies into Glasgow. The COP26 is actually happening really just a couple of miles away from where I'm sitting in the centre of Glasgow. Now, we are planning to increase the number of programmes we make. We have a lot of people ready, designing programmes and getting ready to go out and do interviews with some of the delegates after they fly in. And we could do with your help. Can you look at the link below, please? And we would love to have your help in donating to the programme, subscribing and making sure you pick us up every week and tell people about us. I can give you a guarantee, every pound that comes in donations will be spent on programme making. So the more you help, the more programmes we will do. We have a lot of plans here and we just need your help to make it all happen. So please do that. And every penny spent, we don't get any other money. Of course, we don't get any funding from the government. We don't have a licence fee. So we depend on you. So please help us out. And we have a lot of really interesting people lined up waiting to make some great programmes for you over the next couple of weeks as the world comes into Glasgow. So that's it from me tonight. So good night from me and good night from John Robertson. And we'll see you again soon. Good night.